Hi, I'm Sam. I was just a seaman back then, and I watched an admiral, a man in charge of an entire aircraft carrier, look at a 9-year-old boy like he was nothing more than a piece of dust to be swept aside. That happened just moments before that same kid, little Leo, saved every single one of us from a fight we were about to lose. It's terrifying how much power we give to men who can be so blind. Have you ever been the only one in the room with the answer, but nobody would listen because of who you are? Before I tell you how a grieving boy, using only his hands and his ears, figured out a problem that stumped a whole team of the Navy's best engineers, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe. Believe me, you won't want to miss the look on that admiral's face when the jet engine finally roared back to life. The tension on the flight deck of the USS Independence was so thick you could taste the salt and fuel in the air. We were in the Arabian Sea, and an enemy fleet was closing in fast. Every sailor, every pilot, was a tightly wound spring of controlled panic. The source of it all was Vanguard 1, the lead FA-18 Super Hornet. Its port engine was dead, not just sputtering, but refusing to hit full thrust. Chief Engineer Miller, a man they called Grease because he could supposedly fix anything, was sweating through his uniform. He and his team had been crawling over that multi-million-dollar machine for hours, running every diagnostic, checking every line of code. Nothing. They were calling it a phantom glitch, which was just their way of saying they were completely and utterly lost. And in the middle of all this controlled chaos was Leo. He was just 9, a small, silent shadow in a world of roaring engines and shouting men. His dad had been one of our best pilots, but he'd been killed in a training accident just weeks before. Leo was stuck with us, a temporary ward on a warship sailing into battle, waiting for a transport home. To most of the crew, he was a tragic inconvenience, a sad little ghost reminding them of a fallen friend. He wasn't supposed to be there, especially not then. He was a problem of protocol and pity, someone to be kept out of the way while the real men did their jobs. He'd just glide through the hangar, his eyes taking everything in, never saying a word. What none of them knew, what nobody bothered to ask, was that Leo didn't learn about machines from books. He learned about them from his father. His whole childhood was spent in hangars just like this one. His dad didn't teach him how to throw a baseball. He taught him to listen to an engine's heartbeat, to feel the rhythm of the hydraulics, to understand the nerves in the wiring. The kid had this strange, almost supernatural intuition for machinery. He could feel mismatched vibrations through the soles of his worn-out sneakers and hear tiny off-key frequencies in a turbine's whine that our advanced sensors couldn't even detect. But he was a kid. A sad, quiet kid in a world run by rank and procedure, and to them his feelings were just childhood fantasy. The pressure was coming down hard from the top. Admiral Hayes, a man who seemed carved from granite, saw Leo's presence on his flight deck as a personal failure, a breach of the sterile operational focus he demanded. His orders were clear and sharp. Get that boy below deck, now. He saw Leo as a distraction his crew couldn't afford. Chief Engineer Miller was even worse. His professional pride was shattered, and he took it out on the easiest target. I saw him physically shoo Leo away from the jet with a greasy rag, scoffing, "Go play with your toys, kid. The adults are working here." The idea that a child could see something his entire experienced team missed wasn't just unlikely to him. It was a personal insult. The strategic importance of Vanguard 1 couldn't be overstated. It wasn't just another jet. It was the tip of the spear, slated to lead the critical defensive sortie against the incoming enemy missiles. Without it, our entire air defense screen was compromised, leaving a massive hole in our shield. The Admiral knew it, the pilots knew it, and every sailor on that deck could feel it in their bones. Losing that jet meant we were vulnerable, exposed. It put thousands of lives, the entire carrier group, at immense risk. As Miller's team finally threw their hands up in defeat, a wave of grim acceptance washed over the deck. They were out of time and out of ideas. The fight was coming and our best weapon was broken. It was in that moment of heavy silence, when the tools were put down and the engineers just stared at the silent engine, that Leo made his move. He had been standing near a stack of supply crates, almost invisible, but I'd been watching him. He wasn't fidgeting or crying like you'd expect a kid to be. He was listening. His head was tilted, his eyes closed, as if he were trying to hear a secret the rest of us were deaf to. Then, with a resolve that seemed far too old for his small frame, he walked directly toward Chief Miller. He didn't run or shout. He just walked with a purpose that made my stomach tighten. I remember thinking, "Oh no, kid, don't." I knew Miller's temper, especially when his back was against the wall. This was not going to end well. Leo didn't even reach Miller. The chief saw him coming from 10 feet away and held up a hand, palm out, like he was stopping traffic. "Not now. Kid!" he barked, his voice raw with frustration and exhaustion. Leo stopped, but he didn't retreat. He just stood there and pointed a small, steady finger at the engine's main air intake. He tried to speak, but Miller cut him off before a sound could escape. I said, "Not now. We don't have time for games. This isn't a playground." The dismissal was so sharp, so absolute, it felt like a physical slap. Several sailors nearby snickered, not out of malice, but out of that nervous energy that fills a tense room. They were just following the chief's lead, and his lead was pure, undiluted contempt for the boy. The humiliation was brutal. It happened right there on the open deck, under the harsh sunlight, in front of everyone. Leo's face, which had held such quiet determination just seconds before, crumpled. He didn't cry, but all the color drained from it, leaving him looking pale and fragile. He lowered his hand and took a step back, his shoulders slumping. For the first time since his father's accident, he looked like what he was, a lost little boy. I felt a hot surge of anger in my chest, directed right at Miller. The chief wasn't just being dismissive, he was being cruel. He was a drowning man, pushing away the one hand that might have held a life raft, simply because it was small and didn't have rank insignia on its sleeve. But Leo wasn't completely broken yet. He turned away from Miller and scanned the faces on the deck, looking for anyone, just one person who might listen. His eyes met mine for a second, and I felt a pang of guilt for just standing there. But what could I do? I was a seaman, a nobody. Arguing with the chief engineer in the middle of a crisis would have gotten me thrown in the brig. He then tried to approach a younger mechanic, a kid barely out of A school, but the mechanic just shook his head and looked away, terrified of being associated with the boy Miller had just publicly shamed. The social hierarchy of a warship is swift and merciless. In the span of 30 seconds, Leo had been branded as a nuisance, and no one was going to risk their neck for him. That's when Admiral Hayes noticed the commotion. He was observing the whole scene from the bridge wing through his binoculars, and his voice boomed over the deck-wide comms, cold and impersonal. "Someone get that boy off my flight deck. He's a non-essential civilian and a distraction. Remove him, now." The order was like a final nail in the coffin. It wasn't just a stressed mechanic's outburst anymore. It was a command from the highest authority. The message was clear. Leo did not belong. He was less than nothing. He was a problem to be solved. 2 master-at-arms started walking toward him, their expressions grim and apologetic, but firm. They had their orders. For Leo, it must have felt like the entire world was telling him he was worthless. As the master-at-arms got closer, Leo made one last, desperate attempt. He saw Commander Eva Rostova striding toward her jet, her helmet under her arm. She had been his father's wingman, his closest friend. She was the pilot for Vanguard 1. Her face was a mask of professional focus, but I saw the flicker of pain in her eyes as she glanced at Leo. She was torn between her duty to her friend's son and the overwhelming pressure of the mission. Leo intercepted her, not by shouting, but by gently tugging on the sleeve of her flight suit. It was a small, pleading gesture, a final appeal to the only person left who might see him as more than just an obstacle. The whole deck seemed to hold its breath, watching to see what she would do. He looked up at her, his eyes wide and shining with unshed tears, but his voice was steady, almost a whisper, so only she could hear it. I was close enough to catch the words, and they sent a shiver down my spine. "It's not the computer, Commander," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "It's breathing wrong. It's choking." He wasn't talking like a child, describing a toy. He spoke with the unnerving certainty of a seasoned diagnostician. Commander Rostova stopped dead in her tracks. She looked down at this grieving 9-year-old boy, and in his gaze she must have seen the same focused, intuitive brilliance she had seen in his father 100 times before. She saw the truth. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, Commander Rostova just stood there, her gaze fixed on Leo. The master-at-arms, seeing her pause, hesitated in their advance. You could almost see the war happening inside her head. On one side was Admiral Hayes's direct order, the rigid chain of command that was the bedrock of their entire world. On the other was the memory of her friend, Leo's dad, and the look of absolute unshakable certainty in his son's eyes. It was a look she'd seen before in the cockpit, right before a high-G maneuver or a difficult landing. It was the look of someone who knew something everyone else had missed. She made her choice. It wasn't a choice born of logic or procedure. It was an act of faith in a fallen friend's legacy. She gently placed her hand on Leo's small shoulder, a simple gesture that was also a clear, defiant signal to the approaching guards. They stopped, confused, looking from her to the bridge and back again. Then Rostova turned, her body language shielding Leo from the rest of the deck, and faced the simmering anger of Chief Miller and the cold, judgmental stare of Admiral Hayes watching from above. Her career was on the line. I knew it, she knew it, everyone knew it. Openly defying a direct order from the ship's commander, especially during a high-stakes alert, was unthinkable. It was the kind of insubordination that ended careers. But she stood her ground, a lone pilot protecting a grieving child against the full weight of the United States Navy's hierarchy. The wind whipped across the deck, but in that small space, there was only a tense, profound silence. Her voice, when she spoke, wasn't loud, but it cut through the air with the precision of a laser. She keyed her own comms unit, bypassing the deck-wide channel and speaking directly to the bridge. "Admiral," she said, her tone respectful but firm. "Commander Rostova, we are out of time and out of options. Chief Miller's team has found nothing. I'm requesting we give the boys 60 seconds. A collective, sharp intake of breath seemed to pass through the crew around me. It was an insane request. Miller's face went from frustrated to furious. He looked at her as if she had completely lost her mind, suggesting they listen to a child's fantasy while an enemy fleet was bearing down on them. He opened his mouth to object, but Rostova's stare was like ice, daring him to interrupt. From the bridge wing, Admiral Hayes was silent for what felt like a full minute. I could see him through my own binoculars, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. He was a man cornered by failure. His best engineers had failed. His multi-million-dollar technology had failed. His command was on the verge of a potential catastrophe. Scrubbing the mission would be a tactical disaster, a show of weakness that could have deadly consequences. Listening to a child was a professional humiliation. He was trapped between two impossible choices. Finally, his voice crackled over Rostova's private comm, but it was so sharp and angry it seemed to echo across the deck anyway. 60 seconds, Commander. You get 60 seconds. Then that boy is off my deck. Is that understood? It wasn't permission, it was a threat. A wave of relief so potent it was almost dizzying washed over me. Rostova gave a curt nod toward the bridge, a silent message received. She then turned her back on the Admiral and the fuming chief engineer, and knelt down, bringing herself to Leo's eye level. The entire chaotic flight deck seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them in a small, protected bubble. "Okay, Leo," she said, her voice dropping, becoming soft and encouraging. "You heard the man. You've got 1 minute. Show me what you hear." All the scorn, all the pressure, all the disbelief from the men around them melted away under the intensity of her focus. She had placed her faith, and possibly her career, entirely in the hands of this 9-year-old boy. The weight of that trust was now on him. Leo didn't hesitate. He didn't look at the diagnostic screens, the laptops, or the complex wiring diagrams spread out on a nearby cart. He seemed to ignore the world of adult solutions entirely. With a solemn focus, he walked past the glowering engineers and straight to the massive, silent engine of the FA-18. He was so small next to it, a tiny figure dwarfed by the sheer power and complexity of the machine. He reached out a small, steady hand and placed it flat against the cold metal of the engine's intake casing, just below the huge, menacing fan blades. Then he closed his eyes. The act was so simple, so profoundly strange, that it silenced every whisper and snicker on the deck. He wasn't trying to fix it. He was just listening. The 60 seconds began to tick away in an excruciating, silent countdown. The only sounds were the howling wind and the distant, rhythmic thrum of the carrier's own engines deep below us. Admiral Hayes stood on the bridge, his arm raised, watch exposed, timing them with military precision. Commander Rostova stood beside Leo like a guardian, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable but fiercely protective. Chief Miller and his team of mechanics just watched, their faces a mixture of raw disbelief and a grudging professional curiosity. What could the boy possibly feel that their advanced sensors and decades of experience had missed? The entire flight deck was frozen, a tableau of hundreds of sailors watching a child with his hand on a jet engine, waiting for the 60 seconds to run out and for the inevitable, humiliating end to this bizarre sideshow. Then, with about 10 seconds left on the Admiral's watch, Leo's eyes snapped open. They weren't wide with panic or uncertainty. They were sharp, focused, like a doctor who had just pinpointed the source of a disease. He didn't shout or proclaim a miracle. He just took his hand off the engine casing and pointed to a small, almost invisible access panel near the base of the intake manifold. It was a piece of the machine so mundane that it blended into the rest of the grey, complex machinery. "There," he said, his voice quiet but carrying with an eerie authority. "It's not a big problem, it's a little one. It's like a tiny rock stuck in its throat. It can breathe fine when it's resting, but when it tries to swallow, it chokes." Chief Miller let out a short, derisive laugh. The sound was ugly, full of pent-up frustration and professional scorn. "A rock? Kid, this is a $20 million General Electric F414 turbofan engine, not a gravel pit. We've run every diagnostic known to man." He held up his data tablet, thrusting it in Rostova's direction as if it were a shield. "See? The system is clean. All pressures are nominal. The fuel flow regulators are green across the board. The computer says there is nothing wrong because there is nothing wrong. The 60 seconds are up, Commander." He was practically salivating at the chance to be proven right, to end this humiliating charade and put the final blame on a phantom glitch, anything but his own team's failure. "Admiral Hayes's," voice finally came over Rostova's private comm, as cold and sharp as breaking ice. "Time's up, Commander. Get him out of there. Prep the backup aircraft." It was the final word. The experiment was over. The Master-at-Arms took a step forward again, but Leo, ignoring the Chief and the Admiral's command, shook his head frantically. He looked directly at Rostova, his eyes pleading. "No, please," he insisted, his voice cracking for the first time. "The computer can't feel it. It's too small. But it's there, I felt it. It's a dusty shake. It only happens when it asks for full power." He mimicked a tiny, vibrating motion with his hand, a gesture so specific and odd it was mesmerizing. He wasn't just guessing, he was describing a sensation. That little gesture, that phrase, "dusty shake," seemed to flip a switch in one of the younger mechanics standing behind Miller. He was a kid named Peterson, barely 20 years old. His face suddenly went pale. I saw his eyes widen as a memory. "Surfaced, Chief," Peterson stammered, taking a hesitant step forward. "That technical bulletin, TB4188, from the deployment in the Gulf last year. It was about microparticle fouling in the secondary fuel filters from desert dust. They said the standard sensors wouldn't trip because the blockage was only partial, only affecting the engine at max throttle fuel draw." He was speaking quickly, nervously, terrified of contradicting his boss, but compelled by a sudden, dawning realization. Miller shot him a look that could have curdled milk. Commander Rostova seized the opening. She turned to Miller, her expression no longer pleading but intensely serious. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Chief," she said, her tone low and deliberate. "We've checked everything the book told us to check. We trusted the sensors, and they told us nothing. Peterson might be onto something. What if the bulletin is right? What if the boy is right? We're out of time. We either look or we scrub the mission and tell the Admiral we were beaten by a ghost." She had cornered him perfectly. To refuse now wouldn't look like professional discipline. It would look like fear. Fear that a kid and a junior mechanic might be right where he and his entire experienced team were wrong. The flight deck was utterly silent. You could see the internal war on Miller's face, his pride, his reputation, his rigid adherence to protocol. It was all wrestling with the undeniable fact that he had failed. He was staring at a dead end. Rostova's logic was inescapable. Scrubbing the mission was a greater humiliation than checking one more panel. Finally, with a sound that was half growl, half sigh of defeat, he spun around and pointed a trembling, greasy finger at the panel Leo had indicated. He looked at Peterson. "Fine," he spat, the word dripping with venom. "Get your tools. Open access panel 7 Gamma. Show me this dusty shake." Prove to me we're wasting our time. It wasn't an order given in hope. It was a command issued in anger, meant to prove them all wrong. Peterson practically jumped to obey, fumbling for his hex wrench set. The simple act of a mechanic approaching the engine with a tool felt more dramatic than a missile launch. Every eye on that deck was locked onto that small, insignificant plate of metal. The two master-at-arms stood frozen. Commander Rostova held her ground next to Leo, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. Up on the bridge wing, Admiral Hayes had lowered his binoculars and was just watching, his arms crossed, a silent, imposing judge over the whole proceeding. The sound of Peterson's wrench fitting into the hex bolt was shockingly loud in the tense silence. Click. The fate of our ship, the career of a commander, and the vindication of a little boy all came down to what was behind that one forgotten screw. The sound of Peterson's wrench turning the hex bolts was the only thing that broke the spell of silence. Click, clack. Each turn was a small explosion in the quiet tension of the flight deck. Chief Miller stood over him, arms crossed, his face a thundercloud of skepticism, just waiting for the panel to reveal nothing but clean machinery, so he could finally end this farce. Peterson worked methodically, his hands surprisingly steady under the pressure of hundreds of eyes. He dropped the last bolt into his pocket and took a deep breath before prying the small metal plate open. It came away with a soft metallic groan, revealing the dark, complex guts of the engine. The entire deck seemed to lean in collectively, holding its breath. The fate of the mission, and a boy's credibility, lay inside that dark 6-inch opening. Peterson reached into the narrow opening, his fingers probing for the filter housing. He paused for a moment, then his expression shifted. It wasn't confusion. It was recognition. He pulled his hand back out slowly, carefully, as if he were handling a delicate artifact. In his grease-stained palm lay the microparticle fuel filter. It was supposed to be a brilliant clean white. Instead, it was caked in a thick, fine, beige-colored grit, so densely packed it looked like a piece of sandstone. A low, collective gasp rippled through the mechanics standing nearby. It was exactly as the boy had described it. The engine was literally choking on desert dust. Chief Miller's face went completely slack, his jaw hanging open as all the arrogant certainty drained out of him in a single crushing moment of realization. For the first time all day, Miller was speechless. He didn't bark an order or make a sarcastic remark. He just stared at the clogged filter in Peterson's hand, then looked over at Leo, who was watching with quiet solemnity. Miller gave a short, almost imperceptible nod to Peterson. It was a gesture of complete and utter surrender. Moving with a newfound urgency, Peterson darted to the supply cart, grabbed a fresh filter from its sterile packaging, and returned to the engine. With practiced efficiency, he slotted the clean white component into the housing, secured the clips, and screwed the access panel back into place. It took him less than a minute. He wiped his hands on a rag, looked up at Commander Rostova in the cockpit, and gave her a sharp, definitive thumbs up. Rostova returned his nod, her face a mask of calm focus, though I could see the immense tension in her shoulders. She gave Leo one last, quick look, a look of profound gratitude, before turning her full attention to the controls. "Clear the deck," someone yelled, and we all scrambled back. She initiated the startup sequence. The auxiliary power unit whined, and then she advanced the throttle. For one heart-stopping second, the engine gave a sick, sputtering cough, the same sound of failure we'd heard all morning. A collective groan of despair started to rise from the crew. My stomach dropped. It felt like we had come so close, only to be let down at the final moment. The hope that had filled the air just seconds before evaporated, replaced by the cold dread of failure. And then it happened. The sputter was immediately swallowed by a deep, rumbling growl that built in intensity with astonishing speed. It wasn't the sound of an engine starting. It was the sound of a beast awakening. The growl escalated into a deafening, perfectly pitched roar as Rostova pushed the throttle to full afterburner. A column of pure heat and power blasted from the exhaust, shaking the entire 90,000-ton aircraft carrier. The vibration went right through the soles of my boots and into my bones. It was a clean, powerful, and flawless sound. The sound of a healthy engine, the sound of life. It was the most beautiful noise I'd ever heard in my entire life, a symphony of vindication that echoed across the open sea, a defiant answer to the approaching threat. The stunned silence on the flight deck lasted for about 3 seconds before it completely shattered. It wasn't a professional cheer. It was a raw, primal roar of pure relief and joy. Sailors were shouting, clapping, and slapping each other on the back. Pilots in their nearby jets were giving thumbs-ups, their faces split with wide grins. It was a spontaneous, uncontrollable eruption of emotion. This wasn't just about a fixed engine. This was about witnessing a miracle. They were cheering for the pilot who risked her career, for the young mechanic who spoke up, but most of all, they were cheering for the quiet, 9-year-old boy who had stood against the crushing weight of authority and had been proven right in the most spectacular way imaginable. In the middle of the chaos, I looked at the men who had been so certain, so dismissive. Chief Engineer Miller stood frozen, his diagnostic tablet hanging limply from his hand, its screen glowing with perfect all-green readings. He kept looking from the tablet to Leo and back again, his face a battlefield of conflicting emotions, shame, disbelief, and a dawning, unmistakable awe. And up on the bridge wing, Admiral Hayes had lowered his binoculars. He wasn't moving. He just stood there, his rigid military posture gone, looking down at the celebration with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. The system he had trusted, the hierarchy he commanded, had failed, and a little boy, a ghost on his warship, had just saved them all. As the roar of the engine settled into a steady, powerful hum and Vanguard 1 taxied into position for launch, the celebration on the deck began to subside, replaced by a profound, almost sacred silence. All eyes turned from the jet to the small boy standing beside Commander Rostova. Leo wasn't smiling or celebrating. He just watched the jet, his expression one of quiet satisfaction, like a craftsman seeing his work perform perfectly. And then there was Chief Miller. He slowly walked over, not with the swagger of a man in charge, but with the hesitant steps of someone who had just seen his entire worldview shattered. He didn't say a word. He just knelt down, looked Leo straight in the eye, and offered him a clean, folded rag from his pocket. It was a simple, wordless gesture, but on that deck it was an apology, an admission, and an offering of immense respect from one mechanic to another. The most shocking moment, however, came from the bridge. The elevator doors hissed open, and Admiral Hayes stepped out onto the flight deck. He was alone without his usual entourage of aides. A path parted for him as he strode across the tarmac, his face unreadable but his purpose clear. He didn't go to Commander Rostova or Chief Miller. He walked directly to Leo. The entire crew watched, frozen, as the most powerful man on the ship, a man who had ordered this boy removed just minutes earlier, came to a stop in front of him. The Admiral was a tall, imposing figure, but he didn't look down on Leo. Instead, he took off his own hat, holding it respectfully in his hands, a gesture of humility that sent a ripple of disbelief through every sailor who witnessed it. Admiral Hayes knelt just as Miller had, bringing himself down to the boy's level. The wind whipped around them, but it felt like they were in the eye of a storm. "Son," the Admiral said, his voice quiet and rough with emotion, stripped of all its commanding authority. "Your father was a great man, a great pilot. But I think today, you taught us all a lesson about seeing what's really there, not just what the manuals tell us to see." He reached up and unpinned a small bronze commendation ribbon from his own uniform. With incredible care, he pinned it to the collar of Leo's worn t-shirt. "He would be prouder than you can ever imagine," he finished, his voice thick. "We all are." In that moment, Leo wasn't a problem or a ghost anymore. He was a hero. In the days and weeks that followed, everything changed for Leo. He was no longer a sad little shadow to be kept out of the way. He became a legend on the USS Independence. The crew gave him a nickname, the Hornet Whisperer. The ship's quartermaster was tasked with creating a custom miniature flight jacket for him, complete with a patch that read Vanguard 1, Chief Diagnostician. He was given unofficial all-access permission to the hangars, and it wasn't uncommon to see him walking alongside Chief Miller, pointing at schematics or just listening to an engine with his head tilted. The engineers didn't just tolerate him, they sought him out. They would ask for his second opinion before signing off on a complex repair, treating his intuition with the same weight as their most advanced diagnostic tools. He found a new purpose aboard that ship, a new family, in the hum of the machinery and the camaraderie of the crew. The hangar, once a place that echoed with the memory of his father's absence, became a space of healing and belonging. He was still a quiet kid, but the crushing weight of his grief had been lifted, replaced by the quiet confidence of someone who knew his own worth. He was a part of something bigger than himself again. He was no longer just the son of a fallen pilot. He was Leo, the boy who could hear the secrets the engines whispered, the kid who saved the fleet with his hands, his ears, and a courage that none of the hardened sailors on that ship would ever forget. The story of what happened that day spread through the entire carrier group, a modern legend passed from ship to ship. It served as a stark reminder to every officer, every chief, and every seaman. We learned that the most powerful assets in a war are not always made of steel, and that true genius, the kind that can turn the tide of a battle, wears no uniform and answers to no rank. It can be found in the most unexpected places, in the quietest voices, if only we have the wisdom to stop and listen. That day we weren't just saved from an enemy attack. We were saved from our own blindness, our own arrogance. And that was a lesson far more valuable than any single victory at sea. That single event sent a shockwave through the culture of the entire ship. It wasn't just a story. It became a doctrine. Chief Miller, a man humbled to his very core, unofficially instituted what the mechanics started calling the Leo check. Whenever they hit a dead end, when the diagnostics were clean but something still felt wrong, they'd stop. They'd turn off the computers, quiet the noise, and just listen. They'd put their hands on the machines and try to feel for that dusty shake. It was a radical shift from a crew that had once worshipped data above all else. They learned that day that the most sensitive diagnostic tool they had wasn't on a screen. It was human intuition. And sometimes that intuition belonged to the person you least expected. The legend of the Hornet Whisperer became more than just a sea story told over stale coffee in the mess hall. It became a required lesson for new officers arriving on the Independence. Admiral Hayes made sure of it. He used it as a parable about the dangers of intellectual arrogance and the prison of protocol. He'd tell them, "Your rank gives you authority, not omniscience. The moment you stop listening is the moment you've already lost the battle." The story served as a permanent, humbling reminder that leadership wasn't about having all the answers, but about creating an environment where the right answer could be heard, no matter where it came from. It was a lesson in humility, taught by a 9-year-old boy in a worn-out t-shirt. Leo eventually took that transport flight home, but a part of him never left the world of engines. He carried that commendation ribbon with him everywhere. Years later, I heard through the grapevine that he'd earned a full scholarship to a top engineering university before he was even old enough to hold a driver's license. He didn't design weapons, though. He went into aerospace, working on engines for deep space probes and next-generation exploratory craft. I like to imagine him in a quiet lab somewhere, his head tilted, still listening for those secrets that machines only whisper when someone has the patience to hear them. He was still searching, not for enemies, but for new horizons, just like his father, but in his own quiet, brilliant way. As for me, I never looked at a uniform the same way again. That day on the flight deck taught me that courage comes in many forms. It's not just about charging into a fight. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand up to your own superiors and say, "Let's try something different." It's about having the guts to admit you're lost and the humility to listen to the quietest voice in the room. I left the Navy a few years after that tour, but I carried that lesson with me into every job, every meeting, every part of my life. I learned to look for the Leos in the world, the quiet experts hidden in plain sight, because that's where the real breakthroughs, the real miracles, happen. The world is full of people who have been underestimated, whose talents are ignored because they don't fit a certain mold. Maybe you're one of them, or maybe you know someone who is. If this story resonated with you, if you know someone who needs to be reminded of their own hidden genius, please share this with them. It might be the sign they're waiting for. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories about the incredible power of the human spirit, especially when it's pushed to the side. Thank you for listening, and never ever let anyone convince you that your voice doesn't matter. It just might be the one everyone needs to hear.